He thought a simple word, hours, could erase 3 years of my life. He was wrong. I built the code, but the license dictates the rules of war. This is the story of how one casual boardroom declaration turned into a full-blown, open-source legal siege. It started small, which is always the most insidious way things begin. Not with a shouting match or a formal HR complaint, but with a casual, almost breezy pronouncement over lukewarm coffee in the break room. "This widget you built, Alex," Marcus said, tapping the screen of his massive, impossibly clean laptop. "It's got serious legs. We should probably just absorb it into the main suite. Call it ours." The widget, by the way, wasn't just code. It was the culmination of 3 years of my life, scraped together in late nights fueled by stale pizza and sheer, stubborn refusal to accept mediocrity. It was a logistics optimization engine, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its efficiency. It could shave 10% off shipping overhead for a company the size of Marcus's conglomerate, and frankly, the scale of the company felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. For 2 years it had been mine. It lived on a personal GitHub repository, polished until the commit history looked like a beautiful, ascending graph of pure genius. I'd shared it with the team, of course, because that's what open source is for. I'd allowed the community, the actual engineers who understood the nuances, the late-night contributors who fixed the obscure edge cases, to contribute. But the core, the beating heart, the original architectural blueprint, that remained stubbornly, proudly Alex's. When Marcus first brought it up, I laughed, a little too loudly, maybe. "It's already yours, Marcus. It's MIT licensed. You can do whatever you want with it. Modify it, sell it, put a tiny little watermark on it. Go ahead." He hadn't laughed. He just smiled, that slow, practiced smile that always precedes a corporate maneuver. "Of course, Alex. But an MIT license is permissive. It's a handout. We're not looking for a handout, we're looking for an asset. We're looking for ownership." That was the first tremor. Ownership. To me, ownership meant integrity. It meant that when I poured my sweat, my sleepless nights, my very essence into lines of Python and optimized algorithms, the resulting beauty belonged to the creator. To Marcus, ownership was a legal clause, a proprietary stamp that could be slapped onto anything, regardless of its origin. The escalation was glacial, a slow-motion corporate siege. First, it was the strategic integration. Then, the internal audit, which was really just Marcus and his legal team sniffing around for loopholes. They started pushing to change the license from the broad MIT to a more restrictive, dual licensing model that heavily favored their internal use case, making it harder for outside developers to build entirely dependent projects without incurring licensing fees. Fees that, naturally, went directly into Marcus's bottom line. "It's not about controlling the flow, Alex," he'd argued during one particularly tense Monday morning meeting, leaning back as if the simple act of sitting in a leather chair conferred infinite wisdom. "It's about directing it. We need to ensure that every time someone uses the efficiency you built, they are contributing back to the ecosystem we manage." "But the community is already contributing," I countered, feeling my jaw tighten so hard my molars ached. "They've fixed the concurrency issues you guys were too busy arguing about to even look at. They've added the geospatial mapping layer. They are partners, Marcus, not just beta testers." He waved a dismissive hand. "Partners are nice, Alex. But a corporate entity with a $1 trillion valuation. We are the primary patron. We are the steward. You are the talented vendor who happened to build the initial draft." The word vendor felt like acid in my gut. Talented vendor. Like I was some glorified contractor who got a bonus check and then vanished. leaving the real value behind for the suits to parade around at shareholder meetings. The sense of injustice wasn't just that he wanted the code. It was that he wanted to erase the narrative of its creation. He didn't want to honor the genesis, he wanted to sanitize it, brand it, and then milk it dry for decades. The tipping point, the moment the simmering resentment boiled over into a searing, white-hot rage, happened during the quarterly review presentation. The lights in the massive boardroom were dimmed, casting a theatrical glow on the polished mahogany table where the executive team sat, like judges waiting for a verdict. Marcus, looking impossibly sharp in a charcoal suit, was mid-sentence, detailing the projected $40 million savings derived from the core optimization engine. And as you can see, he boomed, gesturing dramatically to the slide. A beautifully rendered block diagram of my creation, this engine, which we have successfully integrated and refined, represents a monumental step forward for OmniCorp. It is, unequivocally, proprietary intellectual property of OmniCorp, a direct result of the innovative spirit championed by Alex Vance, but ultimately, a cornerstone of our corporate dominion. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the polite, appreciative silence of a successful presentation, it was the stunned, horrified silence of people realizing they had just witnessed a theft. I felt my hands tremble as they gripped the edges of the table. Every single eye in the room, from the stoic CFO to the perpetually smug VP of marketing, was fixed on me, waiting for the capitulation. Waiting for the humble nod that said, "Yes, Marcus, you win. Take it." My throat felt tight, like a wire pulled too taut. My mind, usually a whirlwind of logical pathways, went frighteningly quiet, clearing out the noise of the meeting, the air conditioning hum, the faint scent of Marcus's expensive cologne. All that remained was the pure, distilled essence of wrongness. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd landed the coup de grace. He thought the MIT license was just a polite suggestion, easily overruled by the might of OmniCorp's legal department. But I hadn't just given him the code, had given him the framework, and within that framework, I had planted the contingency plan. Marcus paused, basking in the glow of his own perceived victory, waiting for my acknowledgement. "Alex, your thoughts on the acquisition?" I looked at him, really looked at him. Not at the tailored jacket, not the perfectly coiffed hair, not the condescending smirk, but into his eyes, those dark, calculating pools that had been plotting my downfall since the first coffee meeting. "My thoughts, Marcus," I said, and my voice, when it finally came out, was low, steady, and perfectly controlled. It didn't crack. "Are that you have misunderstood the nature of the gift." He frowned, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face. "The gift? It's a strategic acquisition, Alex. A leveraged asset." "No," I corrected him, leaning forward slightly, meeting his gaze head-on. "It is an open-source contribution. And the license dictates that when OmniCorp chooses to adopt, integrate, or leverage that contribution, it does so under the terms of the original agreement, unless a formal, mutually agreed-upon amendment is executed." The legal team, seated near the projector, began to shuffle their papers, sensing the pivot. The executives leaned in, sensing the drama. "And," I continued, allowing a small, dangerous smile to curve my lips, "the initial agreement stipulated that any modification, integration, or derivative work must retain the original copyright notice, provide clear attribution to the original author, which, as you know, is me, and grant the community the freedom to build upon that foundation." Marcus opened his mouth, clearly ready to fire back a retort about a corporate flexibility, but I cut him off before the syllable could fully form. "But here is where the subtlety of the original MIT license intersects with the ambition of OmniCorp," I explained. feeling the adrenaline surge through my veins, turning the cold rage into focused, precise energy. Because you are not merely using the code, Marcus. You are not merely integrating it. You are fundamentally repurposing it into a closed, proprietary monolith within your main suite. I glanced back at the screen, at the block diagram of my engine, and then at the small, almost invisible footnote in the corner, the one that detailed the license terms. Your proprietary claim requires you to enforce a restriction that inherently conflicts with the core tenet of the original grant, maximum freedom. I reached over to the presentation controls and clicked a button. The slide didn't change to a PowerPoint slide detailing Q3 revenue. Instead, it flashed a clean, stark block of text, the full, unedited MIT license agreement. When you declared it ours, you essentially declared it ours and only ours, I said, letting the weight of that phrase settle in the room. But the license says, permission is hereby granted. Permission is granted to all. And you cannot revoke that permission simply by declaring ownership. Marcus finally looked panicked. He was losing control of the narrative. And that was the worst possible outcome for him. But the modification clause, he stammered, his voice losing its booming confidence, becoming thin and reedy. We modified the input parsing module. We optimized the database handshake. That is a derivative work. That is ours. Precisely, I confirmed. And therefore, your derivative work is also licensed under the MIT terms, which means, because you are operating under the guise of proprietary, you must now grant the entire world the rights to your modifications. I paused, letting the gears grind slowly in his expensive skull. If you want to claim sole ownership, Marcus, you must grant the world the freedom to use your optimized version of my widget, even if that version is wrapped inside your exclusive corporate firewall. The executives were murmuring now, a collective intake of breath. This wasn't a negotiation, this was a legal declaration of war. So, what is the cost? Marcus managed, his face slowly draining of color. He was already calculating the PR fallout, the legal fees, the sheer bureaucratic nightmare of having to write a massive, legally binding document that essentially said, we own this, but the open source community can use it for free, provided they credit Alex Vance. And they can use it to build a competing product that will make us look slightly less greedy. I leaned back, finally allowing myself a deep, satisfying exhale. The tension in my chest eased, replaced by a cool, triumphant clarity. The cost, I said, letting the final words hang in the air, perfectly weighted, is that you don't own it, Marcus. You are merely the most visible custodian. Then, the subversion. The final, beautiful, devastating stroke. And since you insisted on calling it a cornerstone of your dominion, I took the liberty of amending the license further this morning. A small, purely voluntary addition, to ensure clarity regarding the scope of the ownership. Marcus stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. What? What did you do? I didn't just retain the freedom to use it, I clarified, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, though the entire room was listening. I added a clause requiring that any company leveraging this engine, even under a restrictive proprietary wrapper, must also contribute a minimum of 2 significant, non-trivial pull requests back to the public repository every fiscal quarter. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. It wasn't just that he couldn't keep it locked away. It was that he was now legally obligated to keep building it. And he couldn't do it with his current, over-leveraged, bureaucratic team. He couldn't do it without burning out his best engineers, or worse, having to pay external consultants to fulfill the obligation. You're forcing us to maintain the open source standard, he whispered, the grandeur completely gone from his tone. And no, I corrected him gently. I am forcing you to maintain the spirit of the open source standard. You wanted ownership. You wanted control. Fine. You have control. You have the ability to integrate it, to monetize it, to put your logo on it, and to parade it around like a prize dog. I finally sat back, finally relaxing into the chair that felt like it had been bracing for this moment for 3 years. But you cannot claim it as a completed piece of property. You own the implementation. The community owns the foundation and the right of perpetual improvement, and you, Marcus, are now bound by contract to fund that improvement. The CFO started scribbling furiously, on a pad, his pen scratching like a frantic insect. The VP of marketing looked like he was having an existential crisis over his quarterly branding strategy. Marcus finally looked at the slide, at the clean text of the MIT license, and then at the tiny, added footnote that now glowed with a subtle, victorious sheen. And the adopting entity shall commit to a minimum of 2 substantive contributions per fiscal quarter. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of the invisible legal shackles settling heavily onto his broad shoulders. So, he said, finally, his voice hollow, we have to keep feeding your beast. Exactly, I replied, picking up my lukewarm coffee, suddenly finding it delicious. You can claim the widget, Marcus, but you can't claim the momentum. And momentum, in this industry, is everything. You haven't acquired a finished asset. You've inherited a highly demanding, self-optimizing, perpetually productive, and wonderfully stubborn liability that happens to save you 10% on overhead. Silence returned. But this time it wasn't the silence of stunned judgment. It was the silence of grudging acceptance. The silence of a very powerful man realizing that the most valuable thing in the room wasn't the polished mahogany or the expensive suits, but the simple, elegant, and utterly unbreakable chain of code and law that I had so casually, so perfectly wrapped around his neck. I took a slow sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The rage hadn't vanished, but it had refined itself, hardening into something beautiful and sharp. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that the injustice had not only been seen, but it had been formally, irrevocably, and publicly rectified. He could have had the credit, but he couldn't have had the freedom. And that, in my book, was the only thing that truly mattered.